There it is, ACT Utilitarianism, all in one slide. An act is morally right if, and only if, it maximizes happiness, pleasure, and or minimizes pain for all persons involved. Now, two things should be said here. Just because it is so straightforward, unlike Kantianism, which took two lessons to kind of flesh out, it shouldn't be thought that utilitarianism is any less devoted to reasoning, a kind of a celebration of reasoning. Whereas Kant believed that through courageous reasoning, we can use our faculty of reason to kind of reach out into the transcendental realm, almost like a mechanical arm, and kind of dig out those maxims that we're supposed to live by. The utilitarians are not any less devoted to reason. They think that something that's essentially like a cost-benefit analysis can help you discover what is the morally right thing to do. So that's the first thing we should say. Utilitarianism isn't any less devoted to reason than Kantianism is. The second thing we should say is this. There's still a very Kantian kind of moral logic to this view. So, as we mentioned in the last lesson, everyone post-Kant kind of thinks of ethics in the way that Kant thought about ethics. So there is something very absolutist about utilitarianism. So just like Kant believed that there's these rules, these duties that you must follow, these perfect duties, the utilitarians say that the principle of utility, it gives you a recipe for what to do. And it isn't like, oh, if you want to be happy, then do this. Or if you want social order, then do this. It's more like you just have to do this. It must be done. So they are following a Kantian moral logic in that there is a right action and it must be done. And that's just it. It isn't a hypothetical imperative. It isn't means-end reasoning. It's just you have to do this. And in that sense, it is also an absolutist view. And we'll eventually really define what absolutism means, but I just want you to kind of realize that there is one thing that must be done, whatever maximizes happiness or pleasure. So there is still kind of a Kantian flavor here, or maybe just, a product of the Enlightenment era, this way of thinking about morality. So everything that I'm digging out here for this lesson can be found in Mill's work, a set of essays called Utilitarianism, and I'll show you here in this quote. The creed, which accepts as the foundation of morals, utility, or the greatest happiness principle, holds that actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure, and the absence of pain. By unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure. So just to kind of, continue to flesh out utilitarianism here before we kind of do a little analysis of the view, let's mention another point of contention between Kant and the utilitarians that helps you understand utilitarianism a little bit more. Whereas Kant believed that personhood, in other words, moral rights, are assigned to anyone who is a rational being, i.e. able to live according to principles, Mill believed that all sentient creatures deserve rights. Sentience, by the way, is the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. Now, two things should be said here. This is a much lower bar, if you want to think about it that way, of how to assign moral rights. So remember, Kantian moral rights are essentially only given to rational beings, which means really only humans. And even at that, only some humans, right? Again, it's not to say that non-rational beings can be used. There's still some rules against that, but that's what we covered last time. But Mill and other utilitarians kind of lower that bar. You don't have to be a rational being. You merely have to have the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. So it should be said that I think it's pretty clear that all sentient creatures, sentient as defined here by the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, I guess I should word it this way. All rational beings are sentient creatures, But not all sentient creatures are rational beings. So a dog is a sentient creature, but it isn't a rational being in the Kantian sense. So clearly, Mill and the utilitarians have a much wider net for assigning moral rights, right? There's a whole lot more creatures in the moral community, according to the utilitarians. That's the first thing I should say. The second thing I should say is just to, make sure everyone is on board here. And I have a footnote about this, but sentience, the word sentience, it gets used in many different senses. And I'm using it here in the way that Mill used it, which is to mean the capacity to feel pleasure and pain. I know that some people use this word differently. They use it to mean something like consciousness more generally, but we are not using it that way. When we say sentience, we mean the capacity to feel pleasure and pain, right? So a rock is not sentient, but a dog or a cat is. So that's how we're going to use it. Okay, again, from Mill's essays, Mill argued that we should strive for happiness, quote, to the greatest extent possible, secured to all mankind, and not to them only, but, so far as the nature of things admits, to the whole sentient creation. Now, this is the middle of the 19th century. And Mill is saying to all mankind. By the way, over in the United States, a war was about to begin because certain people didn't want to give certain rights to other certain people, if you know what I'm talking about. So here, Mill, it's almost like he's anachronistic. I mean, he's kind of really ahead of his time. Sure, other people had been saying this prior, but he is fighting for the abolition of slavery, for the liberation of women from the patriarchy, and he wants to go further than that, the whole sentient creation. And that means non-human animals. So Mill is definitely casting that net, that moral community net, much wider than Kant did. Okay. Just so that we're clear on how utilitarianism really works on a day-to-day basis, Mill also endorses subordinate rules, or what we might call common sense morality. So you don't need to do a utilitarian calculus every single time you're making a moral choice. Most of the time, really, just follow common sense morality. According to Mill, these are rules that tend to promote happiness. They've been learned through the experience of many generations, and so we should internalize them as good rules to follow. These rules include keep your promises, don't cheat, don't steal, obey the law, don't kill innocents, etc. These are obviously common sense in that we have learned that these in general are good things to follow because they don't hurt people, or they ensure that we don't hurt people. So again, from Mill's essays, whatever we adopt as the fundamental principle of morality, we require subordinate principles to apply it by. The impossibility of doing without them, being common to all systems, can afford no argument against anyone in particular, but gravely to argue as if no such secondary principles could be had, and as if mankind had remained till now, and always must remain, without drawing any general conclusions from the experience of human life. It is as high a pitch, I think, as absurdity has ever reached in philosophical controversy. So I know that something that's kind of hard to understand Mill's, 19th century English, but the key phrase right there is kind of in that fifth or sixth line, as if mankind had remained until now and always must remain without drawing any general conclusions. Of course, we've learned some basic rules that tend to promote happiness, so follow them. That's a good idea. But, and this is important, note that if it is clear that breaking a subordinate rule would yield more happiness than keeping it, you should break subordinate rules. In those special cases where breaking one of these common sense morality rules would be more beneficial, would have more positive consequences, then in that case you should break that rule. So here it is from Mill's essays. Some maintain that no law, however bad, ought to be disobeyed by an individual citizen. that his opposition to it, if shown at all, should only be shown in endeavoring to get it altered by competent authority. This opinion is defended by those who hold it on grounds of expediency, principally on that of the importance to the common interest of mankind of maintaining inviolate the sentiment of submission to law. So he's saying people that believe in this kind of stuff, that, for example, laws ought to be always, followed without any opposition, they kind of, they're contractarians, right? They're like Hobbes. They believe that you must submit to law. That's what's best ultimately. But here's where Mill's absolutism kind of, comes in. He says, no, if a law or even a common sense morality rule isn't the best, choice, and that it doesn't produce the best consequences, then you shouldn't follow it. So there it is, utilitarianism in a nutshell. Now, what I'd like to do in this part of the lesson is give you some, famous utilitarians, ? I'm not entirely sure that they would subscribe or they would accept being called a utilitarian. Some of them would, but I'm not sure about all of them. So I just want to give you a flavor of what it feels like to be a utilitarian, or what some utilitarians might look like in the real world, sort of, sometimes. So, okay. The first one is Malcolm X. Now, Malcolm X is a very complicated figure. But, let me take this here from the slides. Admittedly, Malcolm X is a complicated figure whose views evolved multiple times throughout his life. Having said that, at some point in his life, he advocated violence as a means to abolish the system of exploitation that benefited whites at the expense of non-whites. So it is no secret that at a certain point in his life, Malcolm X rejected the Christian ethic of nonviolence that was endorsed by Martin Luther King Jr., and instead advocated political violence. He thought that the system of exploitation had to be torn down by any means necessary. That was kind of his catchphrase, by any means necessary. So the reasoning here is, of course, although there would be violence in the short term, in the long term, the consequences would be better because the system of exploitation would be abolished. And so there would be no exploitation, at least from that system. There might be other forms of exploitation that would have to be taken care of, but at least that one would be abolished. So I have some quotes here that kind of begin to give you that flavor of Malcolm X's thinking. I believe that there will ultimately be a clash between the oppressed and those that do the oppressing. I believe that there will be a clash between those who want freedom, justice, and equality for everyone, and those who want to continue the systems of exploitation. So that, little quote on its own doesn't show you Malcolm X's utilitarianism, but of course the fact that he's on the side of wanting to abolish the systems of exploitation by any means necessary, that's what kind of shows you, okay, well, he's looking for good consequences, but he's willing to get to those good consequences essentially by, breaking some conventional rules about nonviolence. So in general, kind of a common sense morality approach would say, yeah, you should probably not, engage in violence as a matter of course. But here Malcolm X is saying maybe it is an ultimate or last resort, but nonetheless it is justified in as long as in the end there is no more oppression of this type. This next quote is much more to the point. I want Dr. King to know that I didn't come to Selma to make his job difficult. I really did come thinking I could make it easier. If the white people realize what the alternative is, perhaps they will be more willing to hear Dr. King. So that was Malcolm X in a conversation with Mrs. Coretta Scott King. So that's MLK Jr.'s wife. So that is more clearly a consequence-driven, analysis here. So there is some evidence here that Malcolm X had engaged in some consequentialist or utilitarian reasoning. Next possible utilitarian, Ernesto Che Guevara. So Che was a revolutionary. He did actively engage in multiple revolutionary actions. And, well, let me take this here from the slides. Malcolm X's contemporary, Ernesto Che Guevara, was even more militant than him. Guevara actively participated in revolutionary movements, including the successful ousting of Fulgencio Batista during the Cuban Revolution in 1959. Moreover, Guevara promoted his foco theory as a fundamental principle of revolutionary theory. So, foco theory, actually, I guess he mentions it in multiple of his writings, but I've only read excerpts of this one, Guerrilla Warfare. In Guerrilla Warfare, Guevara argued that revolution didn't have to wait until the masses held a pro-revolution perspective. Instead, revolutionary violence by small groups of insurgents could create revolutionary consciousness in the masses. In essence, insurrectionary violence would awaken the masses and serve as a shortcut to revolution. So, I guess a couple of things should be said here before I really give my analysis. Number one, revolutionary consciousness and kind of the philosophy behind revolutionary violence, that deserves its own lesson, if not its own course. So there's no way I can, really summarize that right now. The same thing with, the Cuban Revolution. I mean, you almost need a whole class just on Cuba to really understand what was going on there. Certainly a whole lesson on Cuba, at least. And by the way, also, all this whole thing, and this is the third thing that should be said here, all of the events around Cuba and Che Guevara's life need to be all put in the context of the Cold War, which that deserved its own course or lesson as well. So this is, kind of, we're getting into really thorny territory here. But what we can say that might show that Guevara has a kind of a utilitarian ethic about him is that he thinks ultimately revolutionary violence, it is unwanted. Clearly, common sense morality dictates that you should avoid violence whenever possible. But here, Guevara is saying, well, it's okay because ultimately it will lead to revolution. A revolution is a good thing. Now, contrary to what you might think about, Cuba and Fidel Castro and all that, Che was trying to help people. He was trying to liberate people from what he saw as systems of oppression, including everything from, colonialism, capitalism, all kinds of things. So he thought it'd be better, right? So you might disagree on his actual analysis as to whether there'd be more positive consequences than negative consequences. But again, he was trying to help. He thought it'd be overall more positive consequences than negative. And because of that, you can call it a utilitarian ethic. It was, some of you might say mistaken, but still consequentialist in its nature. So here is a quote from Ernesto Che Guevara. "The revolution is not an apple that falls when it is ripe. You have to make it fall." So there he is advocating revolutionary violence. So as I mentioned, these are mostly real people, but this one's actually a fictional character, but I think he's actually a great example of consequentialist reasoning, at least the way I argue. Let me say this. Spock is a tough case, but he at least says some things that appear to be motivated by utilitarian reasoning. For example, in one scene where he is trying to render a volcano inert in order to save a local indigenous population, he states that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So I'm talking here about the, maybe it was 2010, around that time, J.J. Abrams' version of Star Trek. And he clearly says, that consequentialist ethic right there. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So we should also say this. Towards the end of the scene, however, he seems like a real stickler for rules, it might be a good time to add that there are multiple versions of utilitarianism, one of them being rule utilitarianism. In other words, follow those rules that tend to maximize utility and or minimize pain. So let me say this. There is actually another flavor of utilitarianism where you just have to follow those rules that have been showed to maximize utility. And even that would still be utilitarian type reasoning. We're not really going to follow on that. We're not going to really focus on that version of utilitarianism because it looks a lot like Kantianism, which is kind of strange. In any case, I actually think that him being a stickler for the rules is him being a good utilitarian in Mill's sense. He essentially was following common sense morality. He was saying, well, we have certain rules about how we do things and we should follow them. And the only exceptions really are when breaking the rules would be better. So he was willing to sacrifice himself for the sake of the indigenous population because the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So in any case, we're focusing on act utilitarianism. I actually think Spock is a spot-on act utilitarian. But obviously we can debate that if you'd like. He is a fictional character, although a very complicated one, actually. So, I don't know. I'm trying to give you the flavor of utilitarianism here. So I think he does fit the mold. So let me close with this one. This is a less famous, but definitely utilitarian person. And I'm speaking of the real-life philosopher, Peter Singer. So Peter Singer is unquestionably a utilitarian. He says as much. Now, he's gone through different flavors of utilitarianism throughout his career, but you can still get the overall flavor of the view by just kind of seeing what he's associated with. So Singer is associated with flexible veganism. That means he goes back and forth between veganism and vegetarianism. He obviously, he's giving a talk right there in this picture, right? So obviously he travels a lot. If he's on an airplane for 10 hours, he's Australian. So if he's on an airplane for 10 hours and there isn't a vegan meal, especially because he started doing this in the 70s or 80s or whatever, then he's going to be a vegetarian instead, right? So he's a flexible vegan is what he says. Why is this utilitarian? Well, by just choosing a vegan lifestyle, you are not taking part in the suffering of animals, right? Non-human animals that are used for food. So that's an easy way to be a utilitarian. Just switch over to veganism or vegetarianism. He's also associated with effective altruism, which means you do whatever you can, whenever you can. Make sure that your acts of charity, make sure that your acts of altruism, helping others, are actually effective. So if you're going to donate to charity, don't just donate to get a tax break, but donate to charities that you know are proven to actually help people. So there he is. Through a little bit of work on our part, we can actually engage in actions that truly have positive consequences. That's just more utilitarianism. He's also associated with this, donating to charity to the point of marginal utility. So I don't know the amount of money that he lives on, but I know that whatever the university that he works for pays him, he only keeps a certain amount of it and he donates 100% of the rest of it. So I don't remember the numbers, and obviously they might change over the years with inflation, but the point is he donates a heck of a lot of money to charity. And if you combine this point with the earlier point, to charities that are, proven to have a positive consequence. They've been vetted by actually an association that he founded to make sure that certain charities are doing all they can, that they're not spending it on non-essentials, right? That they're actually helping people. Okay. He's also associated with a defense of some actions by the Animal Liberation Front. So the Animal Liberation Front, some people call them terrorists, but at least some of their actions are, you might just call them whistleblowing. And Singer is totally okay with this stuff. I mean, if there are, illegal things being done by, for example, factory farms, then they should be brought out to light, and the public should know about them, and he's okay with that. Planting bombs, which is something that the Animal Liberation Front has done, Singer does not condone this, but it's probably because he says it's ineffectual. It doesn't actually bring more positive consequences than negative, than the negative ones. So there's that, and he's also, I think he's one of the founders of the Greens, which is an Australian political party. Now, this is being recorded in 2021. I know that I've actually talked to some people who believe that the Green New Deal, which is kind of an idea that's being flouted around today, is a new idea. I actually don't think so at all. I mean, it's at least, I think, 20 years old. If I'm going by memory here, but I believe the American Green Party, back in the days of like Ralph Nader, things like that, they were advocating a Green New Deal. So if memory serves me right. In any case, the point of that is, at least Singer and other Greens believe that if you take care of those issues that are going to have the most effect on people, for example, climate change, which is obviously part of any Green Party's platform. If you begin to take care of that, you actually take care of other things, so it will have even more positive consequences. So how would you take care of climate change? Well, you move towards green energy. You also try to get rid of jobs and lifestyles and consumer choices that lead to more greenhouse gas emission. And in place of those, you put in job programs and social support networks that help people that are disenfranchised, right? Or that are chronically poor. So the idea here is always you have sort of a big program that takes care of the environment, but simultaneously takes care of, oppressed peoples and unemployed people and things like that. So that's what Singer is associated with, because he believes that those will have the most positive consequences. So this is utilitarianism through and through, right? You can kind of see over and over again positive consequences. But, and this is kind of the message that I've been trying to drive this whole time, if you focus on positive consequences, if you run that logic all the way to its natural conclusion, then sometimes you end up endorsing some things that on the face of it look like a bad idea, look like they are wrong, but the utilitarians defend them by saying, yeah, maybe they're unsavory, maybe they don't, they're intuitively bad, but they're actually ultimately going to lead to more positive consequences. So Singer is also associated with animal experimentation if the benefits outweigh the costs. So he says, in general, animal experimentation is a really bad idea. Typically, it doesn't outweigh the costs, right? But occasionally, it does. When you're trying new cancer treatments or something like that, you can actually save way more humans and animals through some animal experimentation than you can without it. So he's willing to defend that. And the last one I'll cover here is non-voluntary euthanasia. We will talk about this more in the future, but in cases where a person's life would have more suffering than pleasure, and they can't make a decision for themselves, Singer is okay with non-voluntary euthanasia. So maybe they're brain dead, right? Or maybe they are infants born with some horrible disease like spina bifida or something that's really, really painful, where they're going to live for maybe a couple of weeks or months and then die anyway. He says, well, in those cases, that's just suffering for no reason. In those cases, non-voluntary euthanasia is okay. Now, this kind of sets off alarm bells for many people, but again, it's just utilitarian reasoning through and through. It's more suffering than pleasure. That means it's wrong. So, utilitarianism is very intuitive to some people in some domains, on some issues, but it gets tough when you go into issues like these.